want to talk about the landscape. The landscape now, 2 years later, how the threat to democracy has evolved since 2020 and since January 6th, and especially as we get through the midterms or head toward the midterms in a very short while. Because as the governor said, the choices that we make in 2022 will determine what this fight looks like and what our democracy looks like in 2024. So I'm going to talk about the anti-democracy playbook. I coach a lot of youth sports in my free time. It's my way of staying sane. So I like a sports metaphor. Apologies in advance. But I think we've got some sports fans here, so hopefully it works. Really, we think about the anti-democracy playbook as a simple equation. If you change the rules and you change the refs, then you have the power to change the results. That's it. It's as simple as it is dangerous. Step 1 is to change the rules of elections. Step 2 is to change the referees, the people who oversee and defend elections. And if you do those things, you can try to change the results or the outcome of an election. Now, when I say change the results, I don't necessarily mean waiting until all the votes are counted and then throwing out the result. I'm talking about undermining the will of the voters, because there are a lot of ways to control and change the results of an election. You can restrict access to the polls. You can make it a hassle for people to vote absentee or by mail. You can close polling locations. You can make sure there are long lines and people feel like giving up. You can harass and threaten election officials and try to force them out of their jobs. And boy, have we seen that over the last 2 years. And then after the election, you can turn on the fog machine and create confusion. You can order up sham audits, and I'm using air quotes there for a reason, without any professional standards. You can create delays. You can mess around with the certification process and the defense of legitimate results in court. That's what we're facing today. Let me give you another way to think about it. What we saw in 2020 was basically a pressure campaign. We saw it was a campaign to overturn the election results after the fact. We saw it in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, right here in Pennsylvania. President Biden won all of those states, and Trump and his allies wanted to flip the outcomes, or at least enough of them to make up his loss in the Electoral College. That effort failed, and as Governor Whitman said, we have state officials to thank for defending the results of a free and fair election. But that was a post-election strategy. This time, the other side isn't taking any chances. The strategy is to set up the game ahead of time so they can't lose. So I'm going to walk through that strategy. I just told you about step 1, change the rules. You heard Governor Whitman say that elections are run by the states, even though we think of elections as national events. This is something we try to remind people of all the time at States United. The states hold the key to our democracy, and what we're seeing in state legislatures is not encouraging. We work with an organization called the Voting Rights Lab that tracks bills in the states. And they counted more than 2,200 election-related bills under consideration by state legislatures this year alone. Half of them are unfriendly to voting rights. Now, some of these bills are about what we traditionally think of as voter suppression. So that's provisions to limit drop boxes, tighten ID requirements, reduce mail-in voting. But there's another category of these bills moving through the state legislatures. Think of it as tampering with the machinery of elections, the actual processes we use to count ballots and certify elections. We call this election hijacking. And we released a report about it in August. We counted 244 bills introduced in 33 states that would interfere with election administration. 24 of them were adopted this year alone. What this boils down to is partisan state legislators trying to exert more control over every step of the electoral process. Let me give you an idea of what some of these bills would do, because as a colleague of mine told reporters a couple of months ago, there really is a perverse creativity to it. Some bills would require unprofessional audits of election results. We saw that in Arizona, the governor's pseudo-home state, when a completely unqualified outfit called the Cyber Ninjas ran a sham audit on behalf of state Republicans. Now, many other states want to try it. The point is to call election outcomes into doubt over and over again to create confusion. There's a bill in Missouri that would allow any single voter to call for a recount of all votes and an examination of the voting equipment in a state, One person can ask for it. We've also found bills that are designed to micromanage state and local election administrators, and in some cases, threaten them with criminal prosecution just for doing their jobs. Other bills are designed to gum up the works, like bills requiring all ballots statewide to be hand counted. Think about it, millions of ballots in a state involving many different races, all counted by hand. That would take election administration back to the horse and buggy era. It would open the door to mistakes and delays, and it would increase the chances that someone, of course, could claim it was an invalid election. Here's the most extreme example. A handful of states have considered bills that would give legislators direct or indirect control over election outcomes. In other words, state legislatures could straight up reject the choice of the voters. Thankfully, none of those have become law yet, but it's a huge red flag that a state would even consider it. We could do a whole separate lecture just about these bills, but the point is that partisan state legislatures are trying to exert more control over the process, over the election process for themselves. And they're trying to take it away from the professional, nonpartisan experts we've trusted for decades. And the thing to remember about these bills is that they're a direct result of lies and conspiracy theories about our elections. This is what happens when you have an entire political faction dedicated to the fiction that the last election was stolen. Speaking of lies about the last election, let me turn to the second step of the anti-democracy playbook, and that's replacing the refs. Again, if you change the rules of elections and you change the referees who oversee elections, you can control the outcome. And that brings us to what we call election deniers. As I said earlier, the forces opposed to democracy aren't taking any chances this time. They're using the midterm election to try to install their own people in statewide jobs all over this country. That includes 3 statewide jobs with direct control over elections: governor, state attorney general, and secretary of state. Now, I'll be honest, historically, these aren't the glamour jobs. They don't get a lot of attention, especially AG and secretary of state. But these positions are mission critical for our elections. They are the guardians of our democracy. These are the officials who set voting rules, who decide how much money goes to support elections in a state, who plan the election itself, who oversee the voting and the counting of ballots, who handle certification of elections, and who then defend the results, our votes, in court. You can see where I'm going with this. These are not jobs we can take for granted anymore. And that's because election deniers are trying to fill these jobs all over the country. What do I mean when I say election deniers? An election denier is anybody who has promoted lies about the 2020 election or worked in specific ways to undermine the results. Some attended Stop the Steal rallies. A few were at the Capitol on January 6th and are now running for office. And many, many others have pushed lies about 2020 in what they've said publicly. That includes the so-called big lie that Donald Trump actually won the election. Election deniers are on the ballot in half the races for governor in this country in November, and about a third of the races for Secretary of State and for State Attorney General. That data is from our sister organization, States United Action. They're on the ballot in critical states like Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and of course, right here in Pennsylvania. In all, more than half the country has an election denier running to oversee their elections in November. So what happens if these election deniers win? Well, if even one election denier wins in one state, we've got a problem. That's enough to throw our elections into chaos and put our democracy at risk. Think about Georgia in 2020. The former president called up the Secretary of State and told him to find 11,000 more votes and flip the outcome. Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, told him no. Imagine if an election denier had been in that job. The state officials we choose this year will oversee the 2024 presidential election, not to mention key state and local races before then. Election deniers in office would put us at risk of an election result that doesn't represent the will of American voters, that the loser of the 2024 election has a path to try to claim victory. So that's the formula. Change the rules, change the refs, and there's a lot more to talk about. County officials are already experimenting with refusing to certify an election based on conspiracy theories and sometimes in defiance of court rulings. We've seen it in New Mexico and in Pennsylvania, where we intervened and won in court. You can think of this as anti-democracy forces probing our system for weaknesses. I should add, this is all happening in a tough climate for our state and local election officials who are standing strong against violent threats and harassment. Armed protesters showing up at their homes, screaming through bullhorns, menacing their families and their neighbors. So that gives you a sense of the threat landscape. It's a lot. But the good news is that a lot of people are in this fight trying to do something about it.